Well, good day, everyone. It's Pam here from Pam's Crafty Corner. Welcome back to my channel for another episode of Coffee, Crime, and Crafts. These are bi-weekly episodes that I typically post to my channel where I discuss the specific details of a crime while working on a craft project. It's been a couple of weeks since I've uploaded one of these. I did take a couple of weeks off due to some issues I was having with my back, but today, we're going to go ahead with an episode, and this one's going to take us back to 1974. We're going to take a look at the rather famous story of Amityville Horror. Now, many people are familiar with the Amityville house and the famous story that it was haunted by demons, as several books and movies have been made regarding the purchase of the house by George and Kathy Lutz. But I don't know how many people know the real story of the horrific event that actually occurred in the residence preceding their purchase and what, I guess, put the house on the market in the first place. So today we're going to discuss the case of Ronald Joseph DeFeo Jr. and the murder of all 6 members of his family. And I have my cold brew coffee. I have my craft of choice here. I'm going to work on this cross stitch today. It's a piece that is a kit from Mystic Stitch. It's full coverage. Of course, it's Elvis, and it's called Roustabout. This kit was given to me by Ali from Ali's Stitching Studio, and I'm going to be working today mostly on the section of his face above his eye, coming down into his eyebrow and his forehead area. So grab your craft of choice there and your snack, and we'll get started. So as I mentioned, I'm working on the Elvis Presley Roustabout piece, and I'm going to alternate between working on some of this plain white color at the top. That's a large block of color I have to do, and between doing some of the darker color down around his eye. So the Amityville Horror story, I'll briefly touch on, as I'm sure many of you have already been aware of it, and for those of you who aren't aware of it, it will offer a little bit of context. So in December of 1975, George and Kathy Lutz purchased a 5-bedroom Dutch colonial home on a beautiful property next to a canal with a boathouse and a pool. It was located at 112 Ocean Avenue in Amityville, Long Island, New York. Most people would be familiar with the facade of this house, as it's a pretty iconic image. The Lutzes had 3 children and a large Malamute Labrador mixed dog, and they thought that this would be the perfect property to raise their family. During their walkthrough of the home with the real estate broker, the Lutzes were made aware of the events that took place at the residence the previous year in 1974. The Lutzes did not think that it would pose any problems, and they purchased the house for the bargain price of just $80,000. The Lutzes moved into the home on December 19th, 1975. But they said that they started having issues immediately, which they believed to be supernatural. They heard voices, They smelled a strange, unexplained odor, and they reported green slime oozing from the walls and the keyholes of the residence. They also said that the garage door used to open and close on its own, and they were woken up every night at about 3:15 a.m. The paranormal activity escalated, including knives thrown in the kitchen, visions of a creature with red eyes staring through the bedroom window, and incidents of them levitating in their beds. And there go the dirt bikes up my street. So word of what had been happening at the home got out, and the Lutzes received multiple requests from people claiming to be paranormal investigators, including a request from Ed and Lorraine Warren. They were interested in studying the incidents at the home and were determined to figure out the source of the haunting. The Lutzes also claimed to have the house blessed by a priest. In the end, George, Kathy, and their children only lived in the home for 28 days, escaping one night in January after an incident that they claimed was so terrifying they dare not recount what had happened in detail. They fled to Kathy's mother's house with just the clothes on their backs and a few possessions. The Lutzes eventually signed a book deal. They did numerous television and news interviews and became somewhat famous. The movie, The Amityville Horror, was based on their experiences in the home. But what about the incident that occurred in the home prior to it being sold? What dark history did that house have that could have made purchasing it for a relatively low price, as well as creating a horrible haunting story, so easy? After all, the Amityville Horror in the mid-1970s was today's version of going viral. Well, the real story behind the house was the story of Ronald Joseph DeFeo Jr. At the age of 23, he was charged and subsequently found guilty of killing all 6 members of his family in their home on the night of November 13th, 1974. Ronald Joseph DeFeo Jr. was born on September 26, 1951, to parents Louise and Ronald DeFeo Sr. Ronald Jr., also known as Butch, which I'm going to refer to him as for the majority of this episode. Butch was the oldest child, and he had 4 younger siblings, 2 sisters, Dawn and Allison, and 2 brothers, Mark and John Matthew. The DeFeo family moved into the Ocean Avenue home in 1965, and they raised their family there. However, things weren't always really happy. Ronald Sr. was known to be hot-tempered and would become violent. Butch, being the oldest child, supposedly bore the brunt of his father's rage. And by the time he was 17, he was using serious drugs and had developed a propensity for violence himself. His parents felt he needed psychiatric help, but he adamantly rejected the notion that he needed any help at all. He was forced out of school, and by the time he turned 18, he was given a job at the family's car dealership working with his father. And I think the dealership was actually owned by his grandfather, and that his father was managing it. Despite his parents' effort, Butch's violent episodes became more and more erratic, and his drug use persisted. One evening, a fight broke out in the home between Ronald Sr. and Louise. Butch grabbed a 12-gauge shotgun, ran into the room, pointed it at his father, and pulled the trigger, but the gun did not fire. At that point, his demeanor changed, and he supposedly lowered the weapon and simply walked out. At work, Butch's attitude also became more erratic, and he devised a plan to get more money from the business by robbing it. An employee at the car dealership sent Butch to run an errand to deposit $1,800 in cash and about $20,000 in checks to the bank. Butch returned a couple of hours later, saying that he had been robbed at gunpoint while stopped at a red light. In actuality, Butch had arranged to be robbed on his way to the bank, and he later split the money with his accomplice. At first, he agreed to cooperate with police, but later he refused to go to the police station to look at photos of possible suspects because he knew exactly who had committed the crime, and he was trying to avoid the police and getting in any trouble for it. A couple of weeks later, on November 13th, 1974, Butch DeFeo ran into a local bar in Amityville around 6:30 in the evening, yelling, "You've got to help me. I think my mother and father have been shot." So a couple of people from the bar followed Butch back to his residence, which was located just a couple blocks away. Oh, and there go the dirt bikes again. So, a couple of people followed them back to the residence from the bar, and one of the people that came back was a friend of the family, Joe Yeswit. He actually made the emergency call to the Suffolk Police Department, and when the police arrived, they searched the home and found not only were Butch's parents deceased, but so were all four of his siblings. Ronald Sr. and Louise were both 43 years old. Don was 18. Allison was 13. Mark was 12. And John Matthew was the youngest at just 9 years old. All of the victims had been shot in their beds from gunshot wounds. Richard Sr. and Louise had been shot twice each, and the children all had a single gunshot wound. According to the coroner, the victims had all died around 3 a.m. in the morning. The gunshots, the results of a .35 caliber lever-action Marlin rifle. The police believed Louise and her younger daughter Allison were the only two that were woken by the assailant. The rest of the victims were all found lying on their stomachs in bed, seemingly undisturbed. At the residence, Butch told the police that the killings might have been committed by a mob hitman named Louis Fellini. He seemed to believe that his family had ties to the mob because he thought his grandfather had connections to them. Police escorted Butch to the station in order to get his statement and in order to interview him. Once there, Butch's story changed a couple of times and didn't seem to add up, and there were some inconsistencies in what he was telling them. The alleged hitman, Louis Fellini, well, he had an alibi proving that he wasn't even in the state at the time of the killings. During a search of the home, the police found an empty box for a .35 caliber Marlin gun, and the box was located in Butch's room. But there was no .35 caliber Marlin gun found in the home. As the autopsies were conducted, it became clear that the time of death was much earlier in the morning, around 3:15 a.m., much earlier than suggested by Butch's story, that he found them that way when he got home from work. When confronted with this evidence and the conflicts in his story, Butch became agitated, and he finally broke down, confessing that he had been the one that shot his family. He said that once he started, he just couldn't stop, and it had all happened so fast. He said he took a bath, got dressed in fresh clothes, and discarded the Marlin rifle and the blood-stained clothes before heading to work as usual. At the end of the day, he arrived home and then fled to the nearby bar to make it seem like he had just discovered the gruesome crime. With the confession, the police had enough to charge Ronald DeFeo Jr. with the murder of his family. And his trial began almost a year later on October 14, 1975. So what exactly did happen that night in 1974? Well, piecing witness accounts as well as evidence together, the events of the day unfolded something like this. Yes, Butch did kill his family around 3:15 in the morning. He possibly then did bathe and stayed at the house for a while before leaving early for work. At around 6 a.m., a neighbor noticed that lights were on inside the DeFeo residence as he was walking his dog. He thought this was odd as he had never seen them on that early in the morning before when he was out. At 6:30 a.m., Butch arrived at the car dealership. It was well before the dealership opened, so he parked his car in front of the garage, and he was discovered sleeping behind the wheel a few hours later by the service manager when the dealership opened. Ronald DeFeo Sr. didn't arrive at work that day, but it didn't raise any alarms because his other son, Mark, had broken his leg earlier that year at football, and Ronald would often take him for physical therapy. So that's where he was thought to be that day. So meanwhile, another neighbor, Catherine O'Reilly, she arrived at the DeFeo home to pick up the children for school. Catherine saw the family car in the driveway, but she got no answer. So she dropped her own children off at school and then stopped by the residence again on her way back around 8:40 a.m. But still, there was no answer at the door. Around 10:30, the mailman arrived at the house, and he happened to notice that the family's dog wasn't barking as it usually did. Butch told the police that he couldn't sleep the night before, he was up late watching TV, and that he left for work earlier than usual, but thought that his family was still alive when he left the house. He had no contact with anyone from home that day, and he left work in the afternoon and met some friends at a local bar. He returned home around 6 p.m. and said that he had to break into the kitchen window as he didn't have his house key and he couldn't get any answer at the door. Once inside, he discovered his parents deceased, and he fled to the bar to get help. Which brings us back to the previous timeline that we discussed earlier that he told police. So this is where he says, I was at work all day, I got home, I had to break into the house to get in, but then once I was inside, I discovered my parents deceased in their bed. That's when I ran to the bar to get help, and, then the police showed up. So after he was kind of, confronted with some of the inconsistencies in his story, that's when he broke down and told the police that he had actually murdered them, taken a bath to get cleaned up, changed his clothing, and then left early, disposing of the rifle. So during the trial, Ronald DeFeo Jr., he's charged with 6 counts of second-degree murder. DeFeo's attorney, William Weber, offered up a plea for an insanity defense, claiming in court that Butch heard voices telling him to kill his family. The defense had a psychiatrist who diagnosed Butch as a neurotic with a dissociative disorder. The assistant district attorney, however, did not believe the insanity plea. They had their own psychiatrist who countered that Butch actually had an antisocial personality disorder. This diagnosis would mean that Butch knew what he was doing was wrong, but that he simply did not care. Now, I'm not sure if these mental health concerns would be characterized the same way today, but I'm simply relaying the details as they were reported at the time. Butch did tell police where to find the murder weapon he had disposed of at the back of the Amityville property in the canal, and he also led investigators to the drainage pipe where he had hidden his bloody clothes and towels on his way to work that morning. On November 21st, 1975, the jury found Butch guilty on all 6 counts of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 6 concurrent 25-year sentences. Since his conviction, Butch has been eligible for parole twice, and both times he was denied. Most recently, in 2015, just 6 years ago. Over the years, Butch has done interviews and changed his story or made claims that his older sister was also involved, that they had both conspired to kill their parents, but Don had lost control and killed the younger children too. Enraged by this, Butch then killed Don, but of course the evidence does not support this theory at all, as Don was found deceased from a single gunshot wound inflicted while she was sleeping, lying on her stomach in bed. March the 12th of this year, 2021, Ronald DeFeo Jr. died while still incarcerated. He was transferred from prison to hospital, and the cause of his death has not yet been released. He was 69 years old. Well, there goes another bike. That's all I have for this episode. I hope you enjoyed the content and that you managed to get some work done on your own craft project. If you did enjoy the episode, feel free to give it a like and subscribe to my channel so that you don't miss out on any upcoming content. I typically upload coffee, crime, and craft videos every second week, and I also post update videos on my various craft projects every few weeks. If you also would like to support my channel and the time it takes to research and prepare each of these episodes, feel free to check out the Buy Me a Coffee link in the description box below. A coffee is certainly always appreciated. Until next time, stay safe and enjoy your crafting. Just a side note as well, I don't know if anyone's going to ask this question, but the tool that I'm using here, because I'm stitching two-handed, is a laying tool. It just helps with making sure that my threads, because I'm stitching with 2 strands of floss, separate and lay flat and that the threads are not twisted. I find this helps with my full coverage pieces, and I tend to like using this more so than railroading if I'm stitching with 2 hands and using multiple strands of floss. If you want to know more about using a laying tool, there is a tutorial uploaded to my channel as well. And here's a look at where the Elvis piece is now. He's got an ear and almost an eye. Looking good.